Thank you, Heather, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be back in the Midwest. I'm a Big Ten guy. And hate to say it, but I don't like Indiana because I went to Illinois. And so that's a full disclosure there. I. That's good. I didn't think I'd hear that from here. But I want to thank Joy in particular. She's a really, among all the other attributes that were listed, she's been a great writer of what was going on during this pandemic and its management or mismanagement. And that, too, is sort of a courageous thing to be out there. And I did meet several great people in the media. They didn't outweigh the numbers I met on the other category, but I did meet them. So with that, I will get my computer going here and begin. I'm going to give sort of a quasi-academic talk here. And the reason is because facts matter. And you don't know what you're talking about if you don't use the facts and know the facts and investigate the facts. And the only way to know the truth is to talk about the facts before you can infer from those things like policy. You would think that would be obvious, but I found it was not so obvious to the people who you see on TV. Now, what happened, which is sort of ironically, I came back from Washington in sort of the third week in November, and my wife met me at the airport, and I looked at her and I actually literally said, "What happened?" And because it was such a blur to me, I was naive, and I could talk about this if it comes up, but I'm not a politician. It's sort of analogous or as an offshoot of what was talked about with Heather and Joy, I was raised to sort of, my opinion mattered as a kid, and I was raised to question authority. And so that was not new to me. I didn't realize what the pushback would be from that, but be that as it may, we have to answer the question, what happened? And although it's impossible to say why, I can at least go through sort of the order of things, and then we could talk about that why maybe later. But what happened was started by the World Health Organization, who provoked a sort of spiral of misinformation by saying that the infection fatality rate was extraordinarily high of this novel, unforeseen virus. And that was misinformation in and of itself, but it was not necessarily intentional. I don't ascribe motive to people usually. But they never understood what was obvious, which was that they were only counting this fraction was the people who died out of the people who were infected, and the bottom of the fraction was a lot bigger than the people who were so sick they went to seek medical help. But that somehow basic, very obvious point was the first of many obvious points that was overlooked. And then the computer modelers took hold and extrapolated from that and made these false assumptions that ignored basic science about the behavior of viruses to say that we were going to have this out-of-control sort of situation. The public health leaders, and I put that in quotation marks because although they are, sort of by definition the leaders, they have really failed us, failed the world, and I'll go through how. They extrapolated from these modelers, and this was promulgated by the media and the social media. And the reason I wrote this diagram like this is because this is going on. This is a cycle. It's not ending. It's not a straight line. This is continuing today. What was claimed was that the SARS virus had a far higher fatality rate than the flu by several orders of magnitude, that everyone has a significant risk to die and no one has immunity because the virus is totally new, that everyone is dangerous and spreads it, that asymptomatic people are major drivers of the spread, that locking down will stop or eliminate the virus, that masks will protect everyone and stop the spread of the infection, that immune protection is only from the vaccine. And every one of these statements is completely false. Many of them defy what a basic, say, first-year medical student learns in medical school. let alone common sense of non-medical average Americans. And so this kind of stuff is almost inexplicable, what was said, but we can talk about this a little later. We heard the policy stated from the beginning was going to be flatten the curve, which meant reduce the infection or slow the infection spread so that we don't overwhelm the medical system, which is logical. Probably the last logical thing that came out of the White House task force, at least I'll say before I got there. But this was said on the podium by Deborah Birx in early 2020. And in early 2020 and then throughout the year, Dr. Birx, who was the head of the White House Coronavirus Task Force, not Dr. Fauci. She was the task force coordinator. She gave all the information to all the governors in writing, all the policy advice. She gave she visited dozens of states with or without Vice President Pence to give the policy advice, the formal official policy advice of the White House. Throughout 2020, for the 6 months before I walked in, during the 3 months I was there, 3.5 months, and then after I left. And so she and Dr. Fauci, who was the most famous, most visible, most influential person in the media, were the official policy coming out of the White House throughout the year. And their policy was very simple. It was lockdowns. They don't like to say that because that is a dirty word now. But what they advised was school closures, shutdowns of businesses, limits on medical care that were not COVID, even closures of medical care that were not COVID, and a host of restrictions, mandates, and quarantines, including things like not even seeing your own family. And the result of that is the governors implemented those lockdowns. Almost every single state implemented these restrictions for the entire year. And the result is that over 750,000 people have had their deaths attributed to the virus in the United States. Millions of families and children were severely harmed. The lockdowns did not stop the spread of the infection. They did not stop the people from dying that were high risk. And they destroyed families and sacrificed our children, particularly low-income children. That's the result of their policy. So if one concludes that the pandemic policy somehow cost extra lives, like Dr. Birx has done to the House of Representatives on official testimony, they better ask her and Dr. Fauci because they advised those policies and they were implemented. The data is grossly flawed before you even talk about what happened and what to do. Why do I say that? Well, PCR testing is a problem, and I'll tell you why. The timelines and trends were determined erroneously on the level of such error that a junior high student would not have made those mistakes. And hospitalizations and deaths from COVID-19 are not necessarily deaths from COVID-19, even though they're categorized that way. This is a paper that was published in early 2021 that showed that at a cycle threshold, which means the number of times you have to average the test to detect the virus you're looking for. The higher the cycle threshold, the less virus there is. And the machine doesn't stop until you get to the certain cycles that are necessary to detect the desired outcome. And when you have a cycle threshold of 35, the data shows that the result of a positive test at that technique shows less than 3% of cultures that actually have live virus. What does that mean? That means that 97% of positive tests on PCR, the way they were done, and the way they were done is the way they were done in the NHS, in the FDA in the United States, and in Israel, to name a few. They showed 97% of the time either dead virus or virus so small that regardless, these people were not contagious. So what that means is, it doesn't mean they weren't infected, but it means that they could be quarantined. You were doing contact tracing on people they came into contact with. You were quarantining their relatives. These people were not contagious. 97% of them. Dr. Fauci said that once, July 2020, At a cycle threshold of 35 or more, the chances of it being replication competent, meaning contagious, are minuscule. He said, you got to say it's just dead nucleotides, period. I walked into the White House at the end of July after that statement. Beginning of August, I started sitting on the task force. He never said that again. There's not a single person in the task force, even after I distributed the data with several papers on cycle thresholds and PCR testing. None of them were aware of it or knew it or discussed it. It was never brought up at a task force by anyone but me. Hospitalization from COVID-19. This is a problem, this categorization, because many people, everyone is tested for SARS virus when you enter a hospital. And this has been going on for months in the United States. And by the way, at that cycle threshold, but that's even a separate issue. And it turns out the data shows that, this is a Stanford University study, half of patients at the pediatric hospital who were categorized as COVID hospitalizations, in retrospect, had zero symptoms of COVID. Okay, they were hospitalized because they were sick. They were sick with something else. They had a positive virus test. The hospital wrote down COVID. This is in the calculations of who's hospitalized with COVID. This is a bigger study from a big California medical center system, and 86% of patients categorized as COVID did not have COVID. I mean, they literally had things like appendicitis, something that totally unrelated, head trauma, but they had a positive test for virus. What about death from COVID? You can extrapolate from that and say, okay, wait a second, maybe these people didn't, some of them didn't die from COVID. Now, no one's minimizing, people died from COVID. There's no question. There are significant numbers of people that died from COVID. But when you look at the data, as the CDC did and published, they said in children, people under 18, a third of them had criteria that were not plausibly categorized as attributable to COVID, and they were called COVID deaths. That's the CDC saying this. We don't know how many people actually died from COVID. If you had to guess, I would extrapolate from the hospitalization data. There's a significant percentage of people in this country who are called COVID deaths who did not die from COVID. I'm not saying that a lot of people didn't die from COVID, but it's just another point to remember. What is the risk and for whom? This is something that is shockingly still sort of misunderstood. The original World Health Organization estimate was a 3.4% infection fatality rate. The data from several studies that were done by one of my now friends and colleagues, John Ioannidis, who's one of the best epidemiologists in the world at Stanford University, calculated from multiple studies that the infection fatality rate is about 0.05% if you're under 70, which is roughly what the infection fatality rate is from influenza for people under 70. Age is a very important risk factor, and it's a highly dangerous virus for older people, particularly older people who are frail in European medical jargon or have comorbidities in our jargon. The mean age for death is about 80. And 80% of deaths were in people over 65. And just to put this into other perspectives, okay, the age gradient of fatality is very important here. When you talk about, oh, this is a dangerous virus, it's really only dangerous for certain people, and that is for people who are very old and have comorbidities. There's a 1,000-fold, greater than a 1,000-fold difference in fatality risk for young people versus old people. And for some perspective, these are several countries, the age at death from COVID is equal to or older than the life expectancy. It doesn't mean people aren't dying from COVID, but there's some perspective that is missing from this narrative, now 2-year-old narrative. What about comorbidities? Because if you're over 70 and you're a marathoner, okay, you're not in the high-risk pool. It turns out, shockingly, I've never heard anyone say this but me, and that's not patting myself on the back. I'm just stunned at the lack of acknowledgement of fact. 2/3 of people who died had greater than or equal to 6 comorbidities. And every time I say that, I'm sure there are people that know this, but there's not many people that know this. And this is CDC data. This is a paper in the CDC publication. The risk to and from children is very low unless you're a high-risk child. And when we say high-risk child, we're talking about a child with leukemia. We're not talking about a child who has some minor ailment. This is data from California, where I happen to live still. And the number of people who died from COVID in children make up 0% of the deaths. It doesn't mean there's 0 children died. There are children who died. And I'm a father. Of course, that's the biggest nightmare in the world. But it rounds down to 0%. Just for perspective, 2 years ago in the flu in California, children made up 5.4% of flu deaths. This is Florida. The case fatality rate, the people who died divided by the people who were ill with COVID, was 0 in Florida for people under 30. The risk to children, there's a lot of data on the slide. I'm not going to go through this, but the second part of this equation is the spread from children. It is known, it was proven in March of 2020 when I first started writing about this, 6 months before I went to Washington, that studies from all over the world proved that children were not significant spreaders. It's not really known why, but that's the fact. And this has never been acknowledged, and particularly in our country. And the reason I say that is because we are the only country of peer nations that didn't open schools for the fall of 2020. This is a sin, and I'm not speaking religiously here. This is immoral. This is a morally bankrupt move by this country. Secondly, the data shows from all over the world that schools are a low-risk environment. Children do not transmit to teachers very often. If I could design a low-risk job, I would say I want to be a K through 12 teacher, okay? There is 0 excuse for teachers to claim that they must be vaccinated because of the children or the children must be vaccinated. That's a lie.
Amen.
Why open schools? Okay, this is obvious. I was the only person in the task force that even spoke about this, even though the CDC had just published a very detailed article in July of 2020 on what the dangers are of having schools closed. Healthy children do not have this was the logic that I presented, okay? And all this stuff, it's not very complicated, honestly. Healthy children do not have a high risk from the virus. The harms of closing in-person schools are enormous, and there is nothing more important to any civilized society than educating children. And there's no argument against these things. It has nothing to do with even spreading. Even if children spread the infection, the schools should have been open. Now, online learning is a gross failure, and it is not because some people don't have computers or broadband. That's another myth. In the country of the world with the most widely disseminated broadband access, the Netherlands, you can look it up, online education was a gross failure. And it may be true that it's partly due to the lack of education of parents, but people have lives. If you have kids, and I'm sure people here have children of different ages, and people have to work, and there's all kinds of things going on, you're not going to succeed. This doesn't even have to be proven, in my opinion, but it was proven. Math losses, 30 to 50% drop. Reading losses, the same thing after just the spring of 2020 closures. In Fairfax, Virginia, the failing grades increased by multiples in junior, middle school, and in high school. Stanford Educational Institute did a study that the first sentence of the conclusions section said, "Findings on learning losses are chilling," quote unquote. The sin of it all is that all of these losses are far greater for low-income families. I mean, this is really, I don't know how to even talk about the immorality of this. This was a class destruction. Lockdowns and school closures particularly, but lockdowns, I always say, are a luxury of the rich. And the outrageous sort of insistence that lockdowns are done by the what I now call the liberal elites, or the elites in general. Okay, I'm in that class, but I'm not an elite. I happen to live and work with these people, and to hear them say that lockdown should be done as they're ordering in all their stuff from Amazon and from food deliveries and going to grocery stores, where who do you think's working in those jobs? It's the low-income people. Lower-income people have those jobs, and this is pre-vaccination. These are people who are insisting on exposing to this so-called, to this virus, while the rich are sitting home saying we should lock down. I mean, there's an incredible, very disturbing picture there. And we know the losses in school closures are well beyond learning. Of course, everyone who has a brain knows that kids learn things more important than what they do from the books in school. They learn socialization. They learn how to resolve conflicts. They learn leadership. They have physical activity. You can't learn that on a computer. What happened as a result of this was worse than learning losses, though. And this is an example of medical claims decreasing from baseline of the year before, all medical claims in teenagers. And that's true because medical care was disrupted significantly. So healthcare claims, medical visits to doctors went down. This is in teenagers month to month compared to the year before. But what exploded were the mental health visits. In teenagers, this is in teenagers year to year. This is self-harm in teenagers. These are kids putting out cigarettes on their arms or cutting their wrists. And I'm sorry to be graphic, but it has to be said. This is a tripling year to year in self-harm visits for teenagers to doctors because of the isolation. The virus didn't cause this. Human beings caused the lockdowns and the isolation. There was a decision made by people in power. Closing in-person schools in college-age kids caused an explosion of anxiety disorder, depression, and other psychological impairments. An explosion in just 1 year. Overdoses and substance abuse in teenagers exploded during the isolation. It has a lasting impact. And I'm going to skip over some of this, but just to say that I think everybody read that 1 in 4 college-age kids in the United States thought of killing himself during June of 2020. That's just after the first 3 months of this. 52%. We have created a public health disaster on the way to potentially destroying an entire generation. 52% of 18 to 24-year-olds had an unwanted weight gain, and that weight gain averaged 28 pounds. This is not trivial. This is during the lockdown. Half of kids in college age report now by surveys they are fearful of all social interactions. This is what we've done, we as a society have done. Nelson Mandela said something famous: there can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way it treats its children. And you know, I mean, I can't say it any better than that, obviously. Now, what is lockdown? Because when I was in the task force, and I wrote about this in my book, at some point, these people who were the lockdowners realized, hey, wait a second, this is not sounding good that we're for these lockdowns, because this is a disaster. And so they said, and actually this is in my book, at one meeting face-to-face, Dr. Burke said to me, no one on the task force is for the lockdowns. And I said, are you for closing businesses? Yes. Are you for closing schools? Yes. Are you for testing and quarantining asymptomatic low-risk people? Yes. I said, then you're for the lockdowns. That was the exact conversation, because at that point I was sort of pugnacious. And you know, I was astounded that these people, again, were concerned with the image of what was happening rather than the facts. And so the lockdowns were obviously implemented. Thank God that we have some people in charge who didn't do that, one of whom is Governor DeSantis. The other is Governor Nome. And, you know, I have to say, they didn't do it because of me, but I was advising Governor DeSantis and Governor Noem since the spring of 2020. And these are rational, logical people. It's not that complicated, but they cared about the health of their citizens. Because it is, frankly, immoral to call yourself a public health leader and try to say, we're going to stop this virus at all costs. I don't care about the public health of everything else. This is almost inexplicable, but this is exactly what was done. Now, what is the data on the lockdowns? I said the lockdowns failed to stop the spread of the infection. They failed to stop the old people from dying. And they destroyed millions of people. In fact, the lockdowns literally killed people. And I'm going to show you that. This is a study in March of 2021 that reviewed the data on 24 European countries, and the conclusion was the findings suggest that severe lockdown policies were not associated with lower mortality. The European Journal of Clinical Investigation, this is Stanford University group, published in January 2021, we do not find significant benefits on the case growth from the severe lockdowns. And in fact, John Ioannidis was quoted about this paper saying the lockdowns in many cases were, quote, pro-contagion. They increased the spread of the infection. And the better paper of all, the best one of all that I've read, is from the Rand Institute in June of 2021. They looked at 43 countries and the United States, and they said that the lockdowns led to increased deaths, increased excess deaths above the baseline if there were no pandemic. Not necessarily from COVID, from everything that counted. The lockdowns longer in place, more excess deaths. Earlier in place, more excess deaths. In the 43 countries with data, the excess deaths were falling. Once the lockdowns were implemented, the excess deaths started increasing. And that increased in the United States too. The lockdowns literally killed people. I was approached, I wondered many things and still do, one of which was, where are the economists? Okay, where are the child psychiatrists? Where are the ethicists? Where are the critical thinkers? Where are the teachers? Where is anybody who has any kind of critical thinking skill? But I work at Stanford, and there's a lot of famous economists there who know a lot more than I do. There's no doubt about that. And I said, where are the economists writing about the body of literature that was known for decades that said that when there's severe unemployment, which you get from a lockdown, you kill people. This is a known thing. This is not some kind of guess. And there were no economists writing about this. And then I was called up by an economist at University of Chicago who had seen that I had been writing in March, April, and he said he wants to write a paper with me. And so we got together, he, John Burge at University of Chicago, Alex Lipton, who is a brilliant sort of computer science, blockchain guru, mathematician. I mean, he's amazing. And he's at Hebrew University. And Ralph Keeney, who is an emeritus engineering professor from Duke. And we got together and quantified that the COVID shutdowns, the lockdowns, after the first 2 months, cost more life years, which is the way you quantify it, double the life years of the virus in 2 months. Okay, and this was invisible in the media. How did this happen, that lockdowns inflicted health harms? Well, here's some of the data that I've said many times, and most of you probably know, but there are 650,000 people on chemo for cancer in the US. Half of them skipped their chemo during the spring lockdowns of 2020. The cancer obviously didn't go away, they just skipped the chemo. 40% of stroke patients, half of heart attack patients didn't call an ambulance out of fear for going into a medical facility. Organ transplants from living donors down 85% during the spring compared to the previous year. More than 2/3 of cancer screenings were skipped. That means about 1 million new US cancers went undetected. That means these people will come back with wider, more metastatic disease, spread disease, not just killing them, but causing a massive amount of suffering. In fact, there's an interesting study that came out from the NHS, and thank God we don't have a single-payer system in this country, because the NHS, and Canada too will come out with this, the NHS says that it will take them until 2028 to come back from the backlog of existing chemotherapy, and another 12 years from now to come back for radiation therapy for existing for existing cancer patients. Now, what do you think is going to happen to these people waiting for their chemo and their radiation therapy? During the first 2 months of the pandemic, more than a third of deaths were not due to COVID, the excess deaths. In the United States, this is well documented. This was documented back in August of 2020. Over the next 20 years, okay, this is a statistic to remember, there will be an estimated 890,000 more Americans die over the next, it's actually 15 years, 20 years, 1.2 million. People die from the unemployment alone. And most of these will be women and minorities. That's how much the people who are the elites calling for lockdowns care about women and minorities. Again, lockdowns were a luxury of the rich by the data. When you look at the unemployment, this is job loss. High-income jobs from a year and a half ago, or pre-lockdown to post-lockdown, this is spring of 2021, there's no job loss for people who are high income, it turns out. Statistically, there's no job loss. But there's a 23% job loss for low-income people. Incredible asymmetry in the impact of the lockdowns. The lockdowns that I call the Birx-Fauci lockdowns were impactful on the world. Okay, why was that? Well, first of all, they interrupted medical care. And that alone, TB alone, tuberculosis, 400,000 new people will die from TB because of the interruption of the supply chain of TB, treatments and screening, etc. Tens of thousands of additional babies will die from malaria in this year. They did die. 1.5 billion children were shut out of their education worldwide from the lockdowns, and that means that they were subjected to sexual abuse, exploitation, violence, genital mutilation, and childhood pregnancies. This is a world horrendous nightmare, what was done. There were an estimated 97 million more people in the world thrown into abject poverty from the lockdowns. Okay, this means $1.90 a day or less living, 97 million more people. And when you have a poor country, like in Africa or Southeast Asia, when the GDP goes down, the life expectancy changes dramatically. It's not like the United States. These people are borderline to begin with. When you shut down in Bangladesh, when you shut down the clothing industry, because we're not importing, we're not buying, our stores are closed, all these garments are made, many of them in Bangladesh. Most people, there are something like 4 million families depend on garment manufacturing in Bangladesh for their sole income. That industry was completely closed in Bangladesh. I'm just giving one small example of total devastation from the lockdowns of the Western world. And this is a study that was published in the fall, or in the spring to fall 2021, that showed in 124 countries, 1.2 billion life years were lost, which is 25 times more than the life years lost due to the virus. Okay, it's really stunning. That's the science, I like to say. Now, what was the alternative? Well, the alternative was put forward first, I think, by John Ioannidis back in early March, and then by me, and then other people, Gupta, Bhattacharya, Kuldorf, and others, of something called targeted protection or focused protection, which means what any logical person would think, which is we know who's vulnerable, increase the protection of the people who are vulnerable. We know who's not vulnerable, don't destroy them. And so increase the protection of the high-risk group with an unprecedented focus, monitor the hospitals to make sure there's not overcrowding and give them resources, and reopen carefully society, particularly, but not only, including schools. In October, the Great Barrington Declaration was written. And these guys are my friends, and I was in the White House and did not want to sign any petitions, so I didn't sign anything. And I also didn't want to distract from anything that they were doing, but you'll see in the book, but I brought in to the White House, by the way, doctors from UCLA, Tufts, Harvard, and Stanford to meet with the president. This was scheduled at a time when Dr. Birx could attend, because my role as an advisor on the biggest healthcare crisis in a century was to make sure there's people who are experts, who are doing the research, give information to the President of the United States. And Dr. Birx didn't go to the meeting. She refused to come to the meeting 24 hours before the meeting. And the meeting was suppressed by the White House because they didn't want, I put this in the book, I'm just saying it because these things are in my mind and it's impossible to not say. Because they said, Scott, don't rock the boat. And my answer was, excuse my language, but I said, the boat is effing capsized. And, you know, that didn't carry the day, and the meeting was suppressed, but I have photos and recorded it, and the president loved the meeting. They gave me 5 minutes to have the meeting after Dr. Birx refused to go, and it was thought to be a very politically volatile thing internally. And they said, okay, you get 5 minutes. And so I said, okay. And these guys were already in the air. And I had people, pediatric infectious disease people, epidemiologists, virus medical scientists, public health people, national experts. And 2 of them were Drs. Jay Bhattacharya of Stanford and Dr. Martin Kulldorff. And so we were in there, and the president was thrilled, and he asked questions. The meeting went almost an hour. And he wanted to have pictures and a video, and you never heard about the meeting. This is the first time anybody's ever talked about this, was me in my book. But it's just, what's shocking about the whole thing was, these people were bureaucrats on the task force. Okay, these people, Drs. Birx and Fauci, were government bureaucrats for 40 years. That's what their jobs were. I was very different. Okay, I was a health policy researcher for the past 10 years, full-time at Hoover Institution. 25 years before that, I was for 25 years a medical scientist in academic medical centers all over the country. My role was to give information, to critique the science, to critique the literature. And this was not what they thought their role was. In fact, when I gave the data in the task force meetings, I was the only one with scientific papers. I went through data from 12, 20 studies when I was asked a question. And the only responses were silence and "you're an outlier" was the response. And so I felt, okay, I'm going to bring in some people who know what they're talking about. And we did. And the president heard their message, and the people heard their messages. It didn't carry the day because the governors implemented what Birx and Fauci recommended. But there were a few people, and I think it was very important to say the truth. Now, Great Barrington Declaration was written in October, and the president actually, newly elected, I think he was, no, he wasn't elected. Joe Biden was a candidate, and he went on 60 Minutes. And he said, quote, "No one believes what Scott Atlas is saying. No doctor believes that." And so when I had Twitter, before it was deleted, I wrote, well, you know, there's 43,000 medical practitioners and 15,000 medical and public health scientists. That's a lot of nobodies. Had to get that off my chest. Okay, we have an internal control on the lockdowns, and that happens to be the state of Florida. And I picked Florida for a lot of reasons. One is that it's a big, heterogeneous state. There's a mix of urban and rural. There's a mix of ethnicities. There's a mix of incomes. It's it's a very heterogeneous state that is very important to look at, and it's very similar to my state, California. So how did Florida do after a full year? Okay, this is data from the spring of 2021. COVID deaths per capita. Florida outperformed the United States statistically and 25 different states, all of whom did lockdowns. Now, I just want to interrupt myself here. Florida does not have to outperform anybody. It's the burden of the states that inflicted the collateral damage that has to say they saved lives or they did something terrible. Okay, the burden's not on Florida. The burden is on the other states. Florida outperformed by 24% the overall excess mortality increase in the United States and 2/3 of states in excess mortality. Age-adjusted COVID mortality. Florida outperformed by 40% the overall United States. They outperformed 40 states. This is as of spring 2021, and including 40 states for people 65 plus, the high-risk group. What about Florida versus California? Again, they're very similar states in terms of their composition. They're very different in two ways. Number one, California is a very young state. Florida is a very old state. That's very relevant to a disease that really essentially kills the old people. So Florida's got a handicap there. But the bigger difference actually is Florida did not lock down. They opened widely since the summer of 2020. In fact, they opened all their schools. Every student had the opportunity to go to in-person schools in Florida since the fall. That's what this green on the top graph is showing. That's the percent of schools open. Green is open, that's 100%. California had 17% roughly of students open. And how did they do? Well, California had the strong lockdowns. In fact, they still do in many ways. It's not a lockdown at this point, but there's a tremendous amount of burden. I happen to live in the county with the most stringent regulations, much to my good luck. And how did they do compared to California? After year one, age-adjusted COVID mortality was worse in California than Florida. Remember, the burden's on the other states. It's not on Florida to outperform. Excess mortality increased. California did worse. Now we're seeing something different, and now the newspapers at the end of the summer, as you probably read, were sort of very critical, I'll say. I won't make a judgment on it, but they were very critical about DeSantis, as they've been for quite a while, because he didn't lock down. He refused to lock down, and he knew the data. And there was a surge of cases, and this is July 25, where dark is no cases and very bright yellow is high cases. And you can see the surge in July 2025 that we had and have had this summer, fall, began in Florida. And they were saying, oh, look at Florida, it's a disaster. And it was obvious to anyone who was conscious that this was the way it worked all the time. And so now by the end of in the fall, October, we see that the Florida now in the southern part of the U.S. has very low cases, and the rest of the country has a lot of cases. And why did we know that would happen? Because that's exactly what happened a year before. These are the same maps from July and November of 2020. Okay, it's exactly the same. I was writing the book when the surge was happening, and in the foreword of the book, I didn't know, and it's very dangerous to make projections, but I said, I think the cases will probably come down in Florida and go up everywhere else, but it was sort of obvious. What about after the summer surge? This is after the summer surge. Okay, so the rest of the country is still having high cases, a lot of the country. Florida's done. Florida doesn't have cases. And the excess mortality, after a lot of people died in Florida, but not yet in other places, showed that California and Florida have the same excess mortality. This is after Florida has had another surge that hadn't hit other places yet, but the burden is not on Florida to outperform. So even with the additional surge, is what I'm saying, Florida's non-lockdown policy was better, and they didn't destroy everybody. This is age-adjusted COVID mortality by state. The gold there in the middle is the average United States, and Florida is below the age-adjusted mortality, even after the southern surge that we just had. So, Vaccinations. This is the sort of main topic I think people do want to talk about. I'm going to show you the data on the vaccines. Okay, this is a study in Israel that was published that talked about VE as vaccine efficacy. After about 6 months, 5-6 months, the efficacy of stopping another infection of a vaccine dissipates tremendously. Okay, 39% efficacious here, and the same deal of symptomatic COVID. Because remember, positive test does not mean you have symptoms, but it's the same. The protection wanes after, really, it's 3 to 6 months against getting COVID, against getting an infection, and therefore, logically, against spreading, the protection against spreading COVID after 3 to 6 months post-vaccine is very low. It is true, and this is the Israel data, that there is still high protection against severe disease or death. That's the Israel data. This is just data from the same study that shows that depending on when you got the vaccine, if you got it very early, the longer the time, the worse the protection against getting infection or against spreading. This is because it wanes over time. But it does not seem to wane against death. Okay, the vaccines protect against death. Okay, and one of the problems with the mandating vaccines, with the false claims about the vaccines, with telling people that their young children must get vaccinated, with this frenzy, is that it has undermined the truth about the positives of the vaccine. And it has created a backlash against even what is good about the vaccines, which is very dangerous and completely, really, again, almost inexplicable. This is a study from Qatar, and you'll notice I'm showing studies from other countries because very sadly, and I never thought I would say this, I trust the data from other countries more than I trust the data from our own CDC. And that's shocking to have to say that. But that's just my honest, appraisal. So I look at Qatar, and we look at Qatar because they're very rigid about who got vaccinated. They vaccinated almost everybody, and so they have good studies. This is a study from October, a month and a half ago, against death, hospitalization, and infection. This is against any infection, and what this shows is that this is a graph of time after the second dose. And so you see that after, say, 4 to 6 months, the protection against getting infection is only about 20, 25, 30%. So again, the protection against getting another infection, if you've never had COVID and you get a vaccine, wanes after 4 to 6 months. This is against death. Okay, so it does not wane. This is their data. Now you look at this number and say, oh, it's 55. Well, but, there's very few cases. That's why these error bars are like this. So you can't really look at that. This is their chart. I'm just explaining the chart. But basically, we have very high protection against death. This is a study from Sweden, which is one of the more rational places in the world, as it turns out. This is from October 25th. So this is new data. This is the effectiveness against symptomatic infection 9 months after vaccination. And you see that there's a dramatic decline. This is differences by age, but there's a dramatic decline here over time against getting another infection. Again, here we have, 4 to 6 months, and we start seeing the decline. This is 9 months out after vaccination against death. And it looks like there is somewhat of a decline here. And then you look at, I made this chart from their data, and you look at the data. They have 4 million people in the study, by the way. And we see that there is still very high protection against death, but it wanes in people who are over 80 years old. And it wanes down to still reasonable protection. You have to realize the expectation that a vaccine will protect against all death is in and of itself irrational, but no one's been explained this. If you look at influenza, 50% of the people that die from influenza had the flu vaccine that season. Okay, so to expect any vaccine to completely protect against death is just not, it's just not how it works. So to say that there's 83% here, 9 months out for death, that's very, very good protection. It's not as good as having had the infection. Okay? And again, we look at a good study here. This is the best study right now, and this is from Israel. It was published at the end of August of this year. And they looked at people who were recovered from infection but unvaccinated compared to people who were vaccinated but never had the infection. And what it shows is that protection against symptomatic infection is 27-fold better in people who had the COVID infection and recovered compared to people who were vaccinated but never infected. Eightfold better against hospitalization. So if you had the infection, you have 8 times better protection against hospitalization required COVID than people who've been vaccinated but never infected. And if you look at the people who have recovered versus recovered and then vaccinated, there's no significant difference. Okay, they don't talk about this. They don't even put that in the conclusion of the paper. That's in their data, but they don't put that in there. So, the vaccines protect against death and severe disease pretty well so far. We've only had these vaccines for, say, 9 months. I mean, we don't really know what's going to happen, but they seem to be protective against that. They protect against infection, but that protection wanes significantly after 4 to 6 months, to the point where they don't really significantly protect against infection. They do not protect against infection or symptomatic disease as well as the natural immunity of recovered patients. That's a fact. That's not arguable, no matter what anyone on TV who wears glasses and testifies a lot says.
And the white coat.
Yes, there are safety concerns about the vaccines. Okay, this is factually true. There are concerns. And it's true about myocarditis in young males. It's a concern. There is insufficient safety data. Okay, we, have not had the vaccines long enough to have real safety data. The emergency use authorization was done in a short period of time because it was an emergency. That's the word. Okay, but normal vaccines take anywhere from 5 to 10 years to compile enough safety data. That's the standard for vaccines. So we don't have enough safety data to really make a case. Secondly, after the EUA, the emergency use authorization, was granted, they then broke the study. Okay, they only had like basically 20,000 people in each group, and after that short period of time, everybody who was in the placebo group got the vaccine. And so we have no control group. Okay, we never did a phase 3 trial. Secondly, there is essentially no, and I'm exaggerating by saying no, but safety on the boosters. No safety data on the boosters. The safety approval of the booster was done on a study of skimpy data of single-digit thousands of people in Israel for 30 days. I think that's not adequate safety data. Eric Rubin, who was an advisor to the FDA on the vaccine approval in children, was quoted. He's the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal. He said something that is really, I think, shocking. We're never going to learn about how safe the vaccine is unless we start giving it. That's just the way it goes. Now, what's interesting is that other countries are not as off the rails. I mean, you're not going to hear people say it because all we read are the headlines about lockdowns and all this. I've been over to Europe. I've been to half a dozen countries in the past 3 months. And you can sense what's happening in talking to people about if they're hysterical or not. And I live in California. I know what hysterical is. But the UK, for instance, in their advisory group on vaccines, their official statement in teenagers is the margin of benefit based on health perspective is considered too small to support advising universal vaccination for healthy 12 to 15-year-olds. Okay, our government doesn't say that. And there are other governments. Germany, the last I looked, did not recommend the booster for anyone under 70 unless you're in a certain specific situation or you're high risk. Well, our government's not saying that. And you have to wonder why. Now that is part of what this is all about here on this slide, which is the trust in America's institutions has been severely damaged. I think we all know that. We all sense that. And that institution word encompasses some we didn't trust before, like the media, but that has been even more damaged than ever. Social media, science and public health agencies and journals, teachers, leaders in education, universities, leaders and professors. These people have destroyed the trust that we as a society had placed in them as so-called experts. We can never again blindly trust people on the basis of their credentials. Never again can we do that. And the reason that they have squandered this trust is they have violated the public good. They have issued erratic advice that is often contrary to the evidence. They have falsely declared consensus in scientific journals with an attempt to intimidate those of us who spoke against that so-called consensus. They have politicized science. The science journals that were the elite journals in medical science ended up publishing, defamatory character attacks against me, but also against other people that were just really outrageous. They're not science. They were never even talking about the data, and the journal editors allowed these things to be published. There has also been, as I said earlier, overt censorship. We all know it. We saw it with YouTube pulling down things, and myself and others, Twitter blocking me as the advisor to the president when I was quoting the CDC and the World Health Organization. And honestly, there has been a moral and ethical failure of judgment by these leaders, including the worst sin of all, like I said, which is sacrificing our children out of fear for adults. The American media has played a bigger role than you can imagine. There is actually data documenting this. This is a study published in the National Bureau of Economic Research in November of 2020, and it showed on a quantifiable way the difference between America's media, mainstream media, and English-speaking media from other countries. Of the stories on COVID, the non-US English-speaking media, 54% of studies were quantified as negative. 91% of America's media studies were negative. Of stories on schools reopening, 90% of major media studies were negative in American media. 56% were negative in our peer nations, English-speaking nations of, say, Europe. I mean, this is a shocking difference. The stories of increasing cases in America's media outnumbered the stories of decreasing cases by a factor of 5.5, even when the cases were declining. Okay, this is a total distortion because in the end, you hear the media, you sort of have to believe the media to some extent. When I went to Washington, as an aside, I was told Jared Kushner. I met everybody on one visit, and they were just saying at the end of the day, okay, Jared Kushner said this is in the book, so I'm saying it. We'd like you to help. Would you help? And I said, well, I just want you to know what you're getting here. I said, I'm never going to say something because somebody else tells me to. I'm never going to sign on to a group statement if I don't agree with it, and I'm never going to change my mind no matter who tells me to if I know I'm right. And to his credit, he immediately said, that's exactly why we want you. And that was very reassuring. And then the next sentence was not as reassuring, because he said to me, I just want you to know that when this becomes public, they're going to destroy you. And, I didn't laugh. And I was shocked because, A, I didn't think he would care. And to his credit, he said that. He said he's concerned. And I paused for a second. I said, okay, maybe I'll try to do this from home. And so I went to California. This is true. And I said, okay, I'm going to do this from California. And, and so in the end, it wasn't working. There was too much happening in real time. So I flew back. And I flew back. And my friends and my family were very concerned. And I said, listen, I know what I'm talking about. I've never had anybody question my CV, and I know more than the media. What are they going to do? If they're going to argue with me, okay, I'm going to get criticized. I had no knowledge, though, of how intense and vicious, really, America's media are. And it is uniquely so. I was, just as an aside, I was invited to give a talk at the University of Milan Law School about a few weeks ago on COVID. And Italy, okay, in Milan, they were hit. They were ground zero, right, for COVID. And there are people there that are afraid. And there's a lot of mask wearing outside. And I'm not making fun of it. These people, they got destroyed by COVID. A lot of the people died. It's not as frenzied there as California, but they are, they're afraid. And I was giving a talk, and I gave this sort of talk there. And a lot of people in the crowd, were not going to hearing. They've never heard this kind of data before. And they're wearing masks and everything. And I'm not going to be a rule breaker. I wore a mask when I got up there, and I took the mask off to give the talk. And I was never treated with hostility. Never. I was asked polite questions. People wanted to learn. And there's something very, very off the rails here in the United States. And it's not an indictment of Americans, because I believe it is really significantly from the media. The media, we need to do something about the media. There's overt censorship, but there is a complete lack of objectivity here, and it's very destructive to the country. And so I don't know who can do something about that. I'm going to finish up with a couple slides. I'm sorry I'm going long. Academia is also to blame here. We've known, all of us, I'm sure in this room, have understood that, okay, the campuses are biased. Most of the people there are one side of the political spectrum. But this is the proof of it. Because what I believe actually is that the pandemic and its management exposed what was there. It didn't cause what was there about these big issues: the politicization of science, the vitriolic media, the bias on campus. It exposed it, because it's easy to pretend like you're nice when you got everything you want. But when your political nemesis is elected as president, you're exposed, because they exposed who they really were. And the pandemic also exposed it. There's 3 medical scientists at Stanford University, Dr. John Ioannidis, myself, and Jay Bhattacharya. We all said the exact same thing. We said the same thing about who's at risk, about the risk to children, about natural immunity conferring protection. We said the same thing about masks being ineffective in a widespread population basis. We said that schools should open, that they're low risk. We said lockdowns were harmful, and we said that focused protection should be used. We said the exact same thing. How do I know we said the exact same thing? Because I was talking to them almost every day. We were writing the same things. I testified to the Senate back in the spring of 2020 with John Ioannidis as independently asked. It's the first time I met him. But we were shocked that we were all saying the same things. Yet there was only one person who was issued a censure by some of Stanford's brilliant faculty members, and that was me. And I don't wonder why. That's why. Because I had the audacity to say yes to helping my country, even though the president was despised by these people. And that doesn't take, it doesn't take somebody who's a hero. I don't feel that at all, but it takes somebody who is simply a decent human being. And I feel that there is a loss of humanity in this country at this point. Now, how do I know that Stanford is politicized? Okay, well, this is the voting data. Stanford has its own zip code. And if you look here, California voted for Biden 2-1. A third of people in California voted for President Trump. This is the analysis by one of the political scientists I work with, Alvin Rabushka. In Stanford's zip code, where you must be Stanford faculty or staff to live, and I live there, 95% of people voted for Biden, and 3.5% voted for President Trump. So that's fine, but I mean, this is a severe outlier here. Okay, this is the original newspaper from the main newspaper of Italy. I showed this in Milan because it took 359 years. This is the paper from October of 1992 until the church finally admitted that Galileo was right and the earth moved. And I'm betting that the lockdowners are going to take longer than that to admit they were wrong. Okay, lastly, Winston Churchill said many brilliant things, including this. Truth is incontrovertible. Panic may resent it. Ignorance may deride it. Malice may distort it. But there it is. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you very much. It's very kind. We can take some questions. Yes.
I do have a question.
Okay, we have some microphones here. Go for it.
I am not by any means in the medical field, but I have read a lot about COVID. I had COVID back in 19 when nobody talks about it. But also the natural immunity of babies that are born because of the thalamus. And I've read about how the thalamus, am I saying that right?
Thymus.
The thymus gland, which looks like a pair of lungs.
There are other people that mispronounce medical words too, as you'll read in the book. They happen to be on the task force. But.
Yes. So, yes, that being said.
So you're in good company.
Yes. I have a daughter who's pregnant, and she is being pressured to get a vaccine, and she won't. She had COVID, and why would we vaccinate a pregnant woman? That was unheard of when I was pregnant, had 4 pregnancies. And why would we try and destroy or change the natural immunity of an unborn child? Okay, so
the real question, I think, is why would you vaccinate a pregnant woman? So I want to I'm not giving any personal medical advice to anybody here, but there are reasons why pregnant women don't choose to be vaccinated for this disease. And the most important reasons are twofold. Number one, most pregnant women are young, and people who are young and otherwise healthy are very low risk for the disease itself. And secondly, there are reports, although there's not good data on this, but there are reports of things that are irregularities in menstruation and in pregnancies. It's hard to get the real data on it. There's not a lot of accurate data. There's not a lot of transparency, I feel, on the data, so I don't know. But I would, if I had a wife who was going to have a baby, I'd be very concerned about getting the vaccine. I'm not telling anybody not to get the vaccine. It's something you should have to decide for yourself with your doctor. The key, though, is you have to find a doctor who knows what he's talking about. And that, these days, is not necessarily so simple. I'm sorry to go on so long.
I forgot to say, if you have a question, please, we get in line in the aisles, and we'll take your questions. If there's others.
Any other questions?
Microphones on both sides. I just wanted to say that.
Sure.
Sorry.
No.
Hi.
Hi.
I forgot.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I love these things. I always get so excited. I have a question kind of about the whole origin period when everything was kicking off. Obviously, we all know the city Wuhan in China now. Do you think it was a manufactured virus? I know my opinion. And what went on from there when crematoriums were burning through the night? Did you hear anything about that with millions of urns being ordered? Is that all? I love conspiracy theories, but I also look into
Yeah,
that?
the question is what was happening in the beginning and the origin of the virus. And so first I'll say I didn't come to Washington until end of July, beginning of August. And so the stuff that came out early on with these emails, the trove of emails from Dr. Fauci that was released, they were from February. They were 6 months before I got there. That's number one. Number two, I was never in on any discussion. There was never any discussion in any meeting I attended. I never heard any discussion about the origin of the virus, and that was never a subject that was that I was either privy to or that I even knew was going on. So the only thing I know is what I've read. And I will answer it this way, that in February of 2020, a group of very prominent virologists wrote a letter to the journal Lancet. It's one of the most famous medical journals, one of the most influential journals, February 2020. And they wrote a letter saying that anyone who says that the virus is not a natural origin is a conspiracy theorist, and it's known with certainty that it's of natural origin. Okay, that letter, that's a lie. That letter was a lie. There was no way to know that. We still don't really know. It's not proven what's going on. There's no proof at this point. And even if I say it very conservatively, we certainly didn't know in February 2020. And that was a very flagrant example of scientists and journals using their sort of trust of the world in stopping the exchange of ideas. Okay, they wanted to intimidate anyone who said it could be a lab origin, even though it was common sense. You might say that it could have been from the lab, since it's right there, and President Trump postulated that, and that's perhaps why they wrote that it could not be. That is really one of the most harmful things that was done, and an example very early on of trying to stop what we need as a country. Without the free exchange of ideas, we will never arrive at the solutions for a crisis. That's just impossible. And secondly, there's no such thing as science by decree of a consensus. It doesn't work that way. What you win on is by the evidence, okay? Right now, it is true that some things are known. Not everything is subject to debate, and I took out my slide that showed a flat Earth versus a moving Earth because that's too many slides. But, the Earth is round. We don't have to keep proving the Earth is round. It's round. But to say that it's known that the lab origin was a conspiracy theory was really a shameful thing for those famous scientists to engage in. And so, but the answer to what I know about China and what happened there is I don't know any more than anybody else with what I read about the burning. I know this. I don't trust the data from China on how many people died. I don't trust their assessment of what they did to, quote, control the infection. I just think it's irrelevant what comes out of there because it's just, you can't trust it. That's my personal opinion. I don't speak for anybody but myself. So I don't know.
I asked the question because the difference between it is it's a virus that came into the world or we're in a new kind of war.
It's a bioweapon. Manufactured.
Well, okay, I understand that sentiment about is it a biological weapon. I have no knowledge on that except to say that I don't want to believe that because that's so frightening that it was intentional. I don't believe that anything came out of there intentionally. I don't believe it. I have no factual reason to not believe it, but I don't believe that. I think it's much more likely. I've been in China. I've been a visiting professor at some of the best medical centers in China, more advanced places, and there's a big difference in the care taken in their labs. It's sloppy compared to here. It's not the same thing. You go to a university medical center here, it's impeccable on what's going on in the lab. So it wouldn't shock me at all that there was a lab accident in a place like that. And so I tend to believe that if it came out of a lab, I think it's more likely than not to have been an accident.
As someone who was in on the, the vaccine and the talks about it and such, my question is, I find it hard to comprehend that we're under emergency use only, which basically is a right to try, and people think that it means it's emergency, to go ahead and do it. But what about the VAERS? I'm wanting to know if that ever came up. I mean, that's the government's
Database of the side effects.
and right now it's astronomical, from their data. And whenever you bring that into a conversation, they're like, oh, well, I don't believe that. It couldn't be that because you don't see it on TV, you don't hear anything else, but it's there. It's less than 10% even gets reported. And so,
Yeah, so
did it
the
even come up ever? And myself and many other people, when you're talking about Trump and he had this information, does he not know, did nobody tell him that all these people are, there's thousands of deaths.
Okay. So let me interrupt because I got the question is what about the side effects of the vaccine? And your second part is didn't anyone tell President Trump? Okay, so there's a timeline here that's very important to understand. The vaccines were not even injected until mid-December. Okay, the compilation of these self-reported side effects did not happen under President Trump. They happened later. Okay, so the vaccine approval, the emergency use authorization was given, as you may remember, after the election. And that first person injected, as we had said on the podium, I had said it because I saw the timelines. I was called a liar, but I had the contracts. I mean, I knew I was just reading them. And we said it's highly likely we're going to be injecting before the end of the year. And that's exactly what happened. We injected first patients were in December, if you may remember. But there was no compilation of side effects on that VAERS database until much later, so months later. That's the next administration. So there was no, as far as I can tell, I mean, there was nothing to tell the President Trump about side effects. There was no cover-up of that. I mean, not that I know of. I don't know anything about that, but it wouldn't even make sense because those things didn't happen then. They happen now. Secondly, the bigger question, though, is what about the side effects of the vaccine? And it's difficult to sort this out. There's anecdotal reports. There's data on. There's certainly some very serious concern about heart inflammation, myocarditis, particularly in young males, and that's a serious concern. And that's why some of these other governments have said, well, we're not going to recommend getting a vaccine for teenagers. There are other things that are being reported. It's still being sorted out. I will agree that there is a lack of transparency, a lack of sort of very solid data on the side effects of the vaccines, and that's very disturbing. And so I like to look at the other countries that don't have what seems to be as much of a motivation. Okay, this is just an opinion. I don't know. I'm just saying that. So I look at a place like Iceland or Sweden that has almost everybody vaccinated, and they don't have a lot of complications from the vaccine. I don't know what the truth is. I believe the following, the bottom line. It's a risk-benefit calculation that you do with your life and everything you do in a free country. And the vaccines are privately protective, meaning people who are high risk, you are protected from dying. If you have a significant risk of dying, the vaccines are pretty good protection, very good protection against dying. And it makes sense to me to take the vaccine if you're a high-risk person. I'm not saying anybody has to. I don't believe in a vaccine mandate. But if you're not high risk, but they are not publicly protective. That's what the data shows from spreading and reinfection after getting vaccinated after a few months, is that you're still going to get potentially the infection 3 to 6 months later and spread the infection. So it's not really an issue of protecting society, in my view. It shouldn't be looked at it that way. It's protecting yourself. If you're worried, get the vaccine. It doesn't matter if you're vaccinated, if I'm vaccinated. It shouldn't matter to me. Okay, because I'm protected from dying. That's why I take the vaccine if I'm a person who's high risk. So it's sort of a simple, again, like it's logic, it's common sense. In a free country, there wouldn't be, in my view, a mandate or a frenzy or lose your job if you're not vaccinated. It doesn't make sense. It's antithetical to American values. Okay.
Time for two more.
Hi, I'll make it quick. I have a question about natural immunity. Two questions. In the studies, they compare the likelihood that you would be hospitalized or die if you've recovered and have natural immunity versus having the vaccine. Does that mean you get COVID again after natural immunity? You're less likely to.
Yes. Okay. So, so there's a study I didn't put out there because I didn't make this looking at it today, but. There's two parts of your question. Basically, you have a very, very, very small chance of getting infected again if you've had an infection. It happens. It's not zero, but it's very small, 4% roughly, from the data that was published. And it's actually out of Qatar. They looked at a ton of people who have had the infection who were never vaccinated. They look at 350,000 people, and they ended up having about 280,000 that didn't get the vaccine, so they got rid of the one. So you have a very small chance of getting infected again. And if you get infected again, your risk of getting a severe disease, meaning a hospitalization required, is extremely small. A risk of dying is 0, according to their study. And your risk of needing an ICU is 0 in their study, if you had the infection. So that's sort of the answer to your question,
Okay.
I think.
It's an odd comparison. The second question is, some of us have heard that if you've had natural immunity, you've had COVID, recovered, and then you get the vaccine, your immunity is actually decreased from getting the vaccine. Is that true?
Yeah, I don't know. I've seen that stuff a little bit. I'm not sure about that. I don't think that's proven. I think I would say it this way. There's a lot of statements made on the basis of correlation. You have to be very careful. This is what I was dealing with on the task force all the time. Somebody would show us a chart and say on one state, hey, we set a mask mandate, cases came down. Okay, but so what? I mean, it could be, there's a lot of correlations, including the states where you use the mask and the cases didn't go down. But I'd be careful about saying that. I don't know that that's true. I'm not an expert on I haven't looked at it in that much detail, but I don't know that that's true. I'd be careful about believing that.
I think the last question over here.
Since she's a friend, there's two questions. I'll let you choose which one you can answer. Capitalism has given your average man the greatest power in history. So I am not advocating harassing honestly earned income. But is there any objective investigator who has done a forensic accounting on Fauci's finances?
Okay. The question is, has anyone done an investigation of Dr. Fauci's finances? And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know.
And then just really quickly, there's all the studies that show that ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine work. Why is it that when I write a prescription for ivermectin for someone here that they can't get it filled?
So this is one of the biggest, again, sort of strange, almost sinful things that was done by our government agencies that were in charge of research. Back in the spring, we should have known the answer. The studies were never done that were the appropriate studies on ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. This should have been done more than a year and a half ago. I'm talking about a full-blown randomized controlled trial, it's called. And the reason that they weren't done was because the NIH didn't do them. And they didn't do them because, A, they couldn't have even been done because they were such fear-mongering. Once President Trump said hydroxychloroquine should be used, and then there was a backlash against that they couldn't, in many of these studies, they couldn't even enroll enough patients because patients wouldn't even enroll in the trial at the time. There was a tremendous amount of bad publicity, if you may remember, I'm sure, back in the summer and fall of 2020. So there were a lot of reasons to think, even in the beginning, that hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin would work. And the reasons are that the mechanism of action, the way we talk about this in a lab, the way these things work on a cellular level, shows that they should work. They were both safe drugs for decades, used in millions, billions of doses, really. And they were already FDA approved, so they're widely available. So the data was that they were safe and they should work. And then there was clinical data that was not a perfect study that showed, hey, wait a second, it looks like they probably work, even early on. And this kind of stuff was an example of people were dying, and the people in charge, frankly, you have to conclude they didn't care. They had an agenda. They didn't want the studies done for whatever reason. There's a tremendous amount of sort of complexity in how people are corrupt in what they were thinking about, whether it's a conflict of interest from something. It's not all financial. There's a lot of what I would call, there's moral bankruptcy going on in some of these people. There were political motivations. I don't know, but the studies were not done when they should have been done, and this is one of the biggest disgraces of the NIH that will go down historically. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay.
I want to thank so much Dr. Atlas for coming and sharing this.
Thank you.
And before you go,